When today's students hear the phrase classic literature, one word comes to mind: old. It seems to be the general consensus among young people that classic literature is out of date and irrelevant to them. Teachers struggle to excite their students about reading the classics. Studies have shown that students are more enthusiastic and gain more knowledge when they are studying things that they can relate to. So, what better way to excite students about reading those ancient works by Charles Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Alexander Dumas, or Mary Shelley than to show them the universal issues and themes that they contain? Great Expectations, one of the most feared novels in the minds of high school students, with some hard work and dedication can be made into a must-read again. There is a wealth of topics to choose from: abandonment, child abuse, social status, and peer pressure, to name a few. These are all things that young people encounter on a daily basis in some way. If we can show our students just how much they have in common with the characters in classic works like this, they will be more likely to read them. The first step to piquing students' interest is to discuss issues that they are passionate about. One concern that all students have is morality. One needs simply to ask, is this right or wrong? And a healthy classroom debate has students actively involved in discussing a book that they previously had no interest in. For example, Great Expectations Mrs. Joe and her child-rearing tactics offer a terrific topic of discussion. Pip is constantly under the thumb of this overbearing woman who raised him by hand, and the situation could easily be viewed as child abuse. She beats Pip for the smallest infractions using tickler, what Pip describes as a wax-ended piece of cane worn smooth with collision with his tickled frame. She even uses it on her husband. However, the abuse is not only physical, but emotional. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. "Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worrit, or I'd have you out of the corner as if you was 50 pips and he was 500 garteries." "I have only been to the churchyard," said I, from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. "Churchyard," repeated my sister. "If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand?" "You did," said I. "And why did I do it, I should like to know?" exclaimed my sister. I whimpered, "I don't know." "I don't," said my sister. "I'd never do it again. I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since born you were. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife, and him a gardery, without being your mother." This passage shows that Mrs. Joe, who Pip never calls by her own name, does her best to make Pip feel guilty for being a burden on her. Pip later tells the reader, "I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born, in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion, and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends." It is a common reaction among readers to feel a certain loathing towards Mrs. Joe due to her unwarranted behavior towards Pip and his lovable Uncle Joe. Playing upon that emotion, it would be easy to get students talking about their feelings regarding the situation. Ian Osby of the University of Maryland argues that Mrs. Joe is trying to claim credit for herself that she doesn't deserve by naming herself one of Pip's benefactors. It is clear that Pip isn't benefiting from Mrs. Joe in any way, besides perhaps the little nourishment he receives from the measly meals she cooks for him. However, it is important to point out that Mrs. Joe, having the same parents as Pip, is an orphan as well. We must consider the impact that losing her parents and having no choice but to take in her younger brother had on her. Pointing this out in a classroom will rouse another wave of comments, most of which will probably consist of, "That doesn't make it okay." As if by magic, students are actively analyzing characters in a classic novel. Because Pip is the narrator, we as readers see the world through his eyes. According to Pip, there is a lot wrong with the world. In his article, Betrayal of the Child, Jack Rawlins argues that Pip looks at the world and sees everything out of joint, corrupt, and unfair, but the adult world assures him that everything's fine. What young person has not felt this way at one time in his or her life? There is so much wrong in Pip's world, and the only person that sees it is Pip himself. Mrs. Joe is cruel, selfish, and mad, and the world sees a devoted wife, guardian, and housekeeper. Miss Havisham and her household seem psychotic. The world sees only eccentricity. Even Joe, the one adult in Pip's life that doesn't lie to him and can accept his pain, still insists that Mrs. Joe is a good woman. As Rawlins says, the child sees truly. Adults have learned to see falsely. There isn't a student out there that wouldn't love to hear this phrase come out of their teacher's mouth. Another moral dilemma that spans throughout the novel is Pip's relationship with the convict Magwitch. In fear of his life, Pip steals food, drink, and a file for Magwitch from his own family. He is knowingly aiding an escaped convict by stealing from the only people that have ever supported him. Also, that seemingly depraved action is what eventually leads him to inherit his riches. Students will find themselves questioning if it is possible to do the wrong thing for the right reasons, and if the end justifies the means. The social hierarchy of public high schools can provide another door between the lives of students and Great Expectations. As the title implies, social status is a huge concern in this novel, and persuading students to relate to Pip in this aspect would require little to no effort. Pip is ashamed of his humble origins because Estella humiliates him by focusing on his coarse hands and thick boots. He strives to become a gentleman to impress her, when he would have been content staying in the forge with Joe had he never met Estella. Once it seemed to me that when I should at last roll up my shirt sleeves and go into the forge, Joe's prentice, I should be distinguished and happy. Now that reality was in my hold, I only felt that I was dusty with the dust of small coal, and that I had a weight upon my daily remembrance to which the anvil was a feather. There have been occasions in my later life, I suppose as in most lives, when I have felt for a time as if a thick curtain had fallen on all its interest and romance, to shut me out from anything save dull endurance any more. Never has that curtain dropped so heavy and blank as when my way of life lay stretched out straight before me through the newly entered road of apprenticeship to Joe. He is even ashamed of Joe, even though he was the only one who really loved him. Joe is illiterate and common. When he meets Miss Havisham, he speaks to Pip rather than directing the conversation towards her. He even looks out of place when he is well dressed. According to the article Pip's Spiritual Exercise, the adult Pip must discuss his feelings of embarrassment regarding Joe because they depict the wealth towards which he is self-directed and simple dignity which he is unable to appreciate. Even when Pip becomes a gentleman, he is concerned that he will never win Estella's love because of the identity of his benefactor. Because the money he receives was obtained illegally, he feels dirty for using it even though he came by it honestly himself. Though not all students are concerned with how they are viewed by others, it is something that they are all familiar with. Literary analysis aside, this topic will encourage students to ask themselves important questions. In this instance, Great Expectations can have young people ask whose opinion really matters to them. Again, students will find that an ancient book has something to offer them. Then there's the kicker, the best way to reach students when it comes to classic literature. No, it's not their stomachs, though food as a reward seems to have its benefits. It's their hearts. Every student you will ever have in class has had a crush on someone. Pip's intense infatuation for Estella is something that every single person in your class will be able to relate to on some level. Stanley Friedman, as well as many others, wrote an article dedicated solely to the topic of Pip's feelings for Estella and how they are the source of his great expectations. Even though she makes him miserable, he is hopelessly obsessed with becoming a gentleman in order to win her love. Pip alters his entire life, rejecting his family, for the sole purpose of gaining her favor. High school students have a bad habit of changing themselves to please the person they are with, or would like to be with. Pip never does end up with Estella, or at least the reader never sees it happen, despite all of his efforts. Weiser argues that Dickens' increasingly unhappy family life and his more mature assessment of moral complexities made him unsure that the happy home and loving family are the inevitable or even desirable rewards. However, I like to think that Dickens is telling us that we shouldn't change who we are for someone else. Great Expectations shows us that the people who really matter will love you for who you are. After all of the examples mentioned above, as well as many others that I have not covered, I think it is clear that Great Expectations has a lot to offer. If a teacher is capable of getting students to recognize all the similarities between the novel and their own lives, then they have the potential to have a fantastic learning experience. Young people will see relevance in classic literature again and might even apply some of the lessons that Pip learns in their own lives. I have been told by several people never to teach Great Expectations. It's too hard, and the students won't succeed. Perhaps I want to teach it because I was told it couldn't be done, but I like to think that I want to teach it because it deserves to be taught. This novel and other classic works like it have too much to offer to be left on the library shelves gathering dust. Students just need a helping hand. Isn't that what teachers are for?